The snow fell in thick, quiet sheets over the small town of Helena, Montana, on the night of February 8, 2004. The streets, already blanketed in white, reflected the dull orange glow of street lamps, their halos flickering against the curtain of falling flakes. On the northern edge of town, nestled near the foothills, 26-year-old Rachel Monroe stepped out of the public library where she worked part-time. She pulled her wool coat tighter around her, the wind biting through the seams, and began her short walk toward the parking lot. Rachel had lived in Helena her entire life. Friends and co-workers described her as kind but private, a quiet young woman who preferred books and stargazing to parties and small talk. She had recently returned from Bozeman after earning a degree in history, taking a position as the library's evening archivist while volunteering at a local museum. Her colleagues often said that Rachel had an old soul, fascinated by the stories hidden in the margins of dusty letters and forgotten journals. That winter night, she was working late, finishing the cataloging of a 19th century mining collection. It was close to 8:45 p.m. when Rachel turned off the last light in the library's reading room, gathered her belongings, and stepped into the snow-covered parking lot. She sent one last text to her roommate, saying she'd be home soon. It was the last message she would ever send. The following morning, her roommate, Amanda Greer, awoke to find Rachel's bed untouched. Her car was not in the driveway, and her coat and purse were missing. At first, she assumed Rachel had stayed overnight with her parents on the other side of town. But when she called and they hadn't seen her either, unease quickly set in. By noon, Amanda contacted the Helena Police Department. Detective Samuel Porter, a seasoned investigator with a background in rural missing person cases, was assigned to the file. At first glance, the disappearance seemed ordinary. A single woman, a snowstorm, and a late-night walk to her car. But by the time officers arrived at the library parking lot, it was clear something was wrong. Rachel's blue Toyota Corolla was still there, its doors locked, keys on the front seat. Her footprints led halfway across the lot before abruptly vanishing into the snow, as if she had been lifted away. The cold complicated everything. Fresh snowfall had covered any tire marks or tracks by morning, and temperatures had dipped below zero overnight. Officers combed the area, searching ditches, alleys, and nearby woods. They found Rachel's library keycard buried in the snow near a row of parked vehicles, but nothing else. No signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, no trail to follow. Helena's tight-knit community mobilized quickly. Volunteers organized search parties combing frozen fields and riverbanks. Flyers appeared across the city within hours, bearing Rachel's smiling photo. Brown hair, hazel eyes, wearing the same coat she'd left in. Local radio stations ran hourly updates pleading for information, but the more time passed, the less there was to find. Over the next week, the investigation expanded. Police interviewed co-workers, friends, and anyone who had been near the library that night. A security guard stationed at the courthouse across the street recalled seeing a dark pickup truck idling near the lot shortly after closing. Another witness, a delivery driver, reported spotting a man in a heavy jacket walking in the same direction Rachel would have taken, but in the blinding snow, details blurred. Detective Porter reviewed every lead with care. The truck sighting bothered him. He requested traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, rare for small-town Montana in 2004, but still available in limited form. Grainy images showed what appeared to be a dark Ford F-150 moving slowly past the library around 8:50 p.m. The license plate was unreadable. Despite extensive searches, weeks passed with no progress. The Missouri River, frozen at its banks, was partially thawed by early March, and dive teams explored beneath the ice, fearing the worst. Nothing surfaced. As the months turned, the case cooled, slipping into the liminal space between hope and resignation. Rachel's parents, Thomas and Linda Monroe refused to let her name fade. They held candlelight vigils on the library steps every February, marking another year without answers. "We won't let the snow cover her memory," Linda told reporters in 2006. But the file eventually joined the shelves of the Montana Department of Justice's Cold Case Unit, one of dozens from the early 2000s without resolution. Years passed. The world moved on. New technology emerged, but resources in small-town Montana were scarce. Still, in 2019, Detective Laura Kent, a forensic specialist recently transferred to the state's Cold Case Division, began revisiting dormant investigations across the region. The Monroe file caught her attention almost immediately. Something about the sudden disappearance and the locked car, the footprints ending mid-lot, the unexplained truck, didn't align with random chance. Kent, known for her meticulous attention to overlooked evidence, began by ordering a full re-examination of every item collected in 2004. Among the archived materials were Rachel's library keycard, her car keys, and a few fragments of fabric retrieved from the snow near where her tracks had stopped. The fragments had been too degraded for analysis 2 decades earlier, but modern micro-DNA sequencing offered new possibilities. Working alongside forensic biologist Dr. Aaron Lee at the Montana State Crime Laboratory, Kent requested comprehensive testing. The results, returned in early 2020, changed everything. Trace amounts of male DNA were identified on the edge of Rachel's keycard, a profile that did not match anyone in her known circle. When run through CODIS, the national DNA database, it yielded a partial match. A convicted felon named Dennis Calloway, who had served time for aggravated assault in Wyoming before relocating to Montana in 2003. Calloway had worked intermittently as a contractor in Helena during that period, including several weeks renovating office space across the street from the library. At the time of Rachel's disappearance, he lived less than 2 miles away. Police had interviewed him briefly in 2004 after co-workers mentioned his late-night habits, but he'd been dismissed for lack of evidence. Now, nearly 16 years later, his DNA was the first concrete lead. Detective Kent began reconstructing his movements from that winter. Employment records placed Calloway on site the week of February 8th. A pay stub confirmed he had clocked out that evening at 8:30, 15 minutes before Rachel left the library. Witnesses who had worked with him described him as volatile, often drinking on the job, and known for staying late in his truck near the parking lots. Kent contacted the Helena Police Department to access old surveillance archives. Most had degraded, but one traffic camera, positioned along the main street that intersected with the library lot, had preserved a faint but revealing frame, a Ford F-150 with a missing front emblem, captured at 8:52 p.m. turning toward the lot. DMV records from 2004 confirmed that Calloway owned the same model and color vehicle. Each fragment, the DNA, the vehicle, the timeline, began to align. Kent's team requested a search warrant for Calloway's current residence in Spokane, Washington, where he had lived quietly since 2010. In his garage, investigators found several items of interest: an old canvas tarp with traces of synthetic fibers, a broken watch, and a faded newspaper clipping from 2004 mentioning the disappearance of Rachel Monroe. The tarp was sent to the crime lab for analysis. Under microscopic examination, forensic experts identified 2 distinct fiber types, one consistent with Rachel's winter coat, and another with industrial carpeting used in the library's rear storage room, the same area where Rachel had been working that night. The discovery deepened the mystery. How had those fibers ended up in Calloway's possession? And why had he kept a newspaper about her case for nearly 2 decades? By late 2020, The Montana Cold Case Unit had enough evidence to reopen the investigation publicly. The Monroe family was notified before the media. "We've been waiting for this call for 15 years, Thomas Monroe said softly when Detective Kent visited them. "Whatever you find, just tell us the truth." On a cold November morning, nearly 17 years after Rachel's disappearance, officers from the Spokane Police Department and the Montana Department of Justice executed an arrest warrant. Calloway, now 59, was taken into custody at his home without resistance. When told why, he shook his head and muttered, "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." The news broke across Montana that afternoon. Headlines read, "Montana 2004 Cold Case Solved, Arrest Shocked Community." For the first time in years, the people of Helena gathered not for a vigil, but to listen, to learn how a story long buried beneath snow and silence was finally being unearthed. When news of Dennis Calloway's arrest spread through Helena, the town seemed to hold its collective breath. The library where Rachel Monroe had worked, quiet and solemn in the years since her disappearance, became a focal point once more. Reporters gathered on the front steps, their cameras cutting through the winter haze. The townspeople, many, of whom still remembered the search parties and candlelight vigils of 2004, watched in disbelief as detectives carried out boxes of archived evidence from the police department to the courthouse. Detective Laura Kent, the lead investigator who had reopened the case, knew that the hardest work was only beginning. An arrest alone did not equate to justice. What they had was a web of evidence, circumstantial in some places, strong in others. But after nearly 2 decades, she needed a coherent story that would stand unshaken in court. Working with the Montana Department of Justice and forensic biologist Dr. Aaron Lee, Kent began to reconstruct every moment of February 8, 2004. The timeline emerged with stark clarity. Rachel Monroe left the library at approximately 8:45 p.m. Snow was falling heavily, visibility limited to a few yards. Calloway, whose job site sat directly across the street, clocked out at 8:30 p.m., but remained in the area. His truck, verified through enhanced traffic footage, passed the intersection, near the library 15 minutes later, the same window when Rachel vanished. Phone records from 2004 revealed another critical detail. Calloway had used a payphone at a gas station 1 block away from the library at 9:12 p.m., placing a brief call to his employer's voicemail, claiming he wouldn't make it in tomorrow. The gas station clerk, re-interviewed in 2021, recalled seeing a man covered in snow, visibly shaken, speaking in short bursts before driving off. "I didn't think much of it then," the clerk told investigators. "But now that I look back, something about the way he looked, it wasn't right." In his garage, forensic teams recovered a toolbox containing remnants of blue insulation fibers. Under laboratory comparison, these fibers matched the brand used in the old office building renovation across from the library, where Calloway had worked in 2004. But more strikingly, the same fiber type was identified on the inner lining of Rachel's wool glove, preserved from the original investigation. Piece by piece, Kent's team connected Calloway's surroundings to the environment where Rachel disappeared. The forensic evidence created a continuous trail, not a single thread of coincidence but a tapestry of connection. By December 2021, prosecutors assembled a formal case. The charges were announced in a press conference held in Helena: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful concealment of a body. For the Monroe family, who had waded through 17 winters without answers, the moment was both surreal and devastating. "We prayed for the truth," Thomas Monroe told reporters. "We didn't expect it to hurt this much when it finally came." Detective Kent's challenge, however, was far from over. Calloway's initial interrogation yielded little. Seated in a stark interview room in Spokane, he appeared almost calm. He denied any involvement, insisting that he had never met that girl, and that the evidence was made up from junk. Yet as detectives presented the findings, the DNA on the keycard, the fibers, the newspaper clipping he'd kept, his demeanor began to change. "You've been holding on to this for almost 20 years, Kent said quietly during the recorded session. "People move on, but the evidence doesn't. The truth doesn't. It waits." Calloway leaned back in his chair, exhaled and said, "You think you know what happened, but you don't. Nobody does." He refused to elaborate further. Prosecutors built the case methodically, anticipating every argument the defense would raise. They knew that defense counsel would question the reliability of DNA recovered from decades-old evidence, would challenge the memory of witnesses, and would imply contamination. To counter this, Dr. Lee's laboratory conducted multiple blind tests, confirming that the male DNA extracted from Rachel's keycard was uncontaminated and conclusively linked to Calloway's profile. The team also uncovered additional supporting evidence. A set of work orders from 2004 listed Calloway as responsible for after-hours maintenance inside the same library building where Rachel had worked, a detail overlooked in the original investigation. The records proved he had key access to the side maintenance door, which faced the parking lot where her footprints ended. That door had been reported slightly ajar the following morning, but police in 2004 had attributed it to weather. In light of the new findings, it took on grim significance. The theory that emerged was chillingly clear. Calloway had waited until the library closed, approached Rachel as she headed to her car, and lured her toward the maintenance door, possibly under the pretense of assistance or conversation. From there she disappeared into the building, unseen, unheard, and lost to the snow. As forensic teams analyzed the items from Calloway's garage, one discovery sealed the connection. Inside a weathered storage box, they found a woman's hair clip, tarnished but intact. The style matched one Rachel had been wearing the night she vanished, visible in surveillance footage from earlier that evening. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed it was hers. In January 2022, the case went to trial in Helena District Court. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from across the state, community members, Rachel's former colleagues, and friends who had long refused to let her memory fade. The prosecution's opening statement began not with evidence but with a simple reminder of time. 18 years, said prosecutor Daniel Holt, is a long time to wait for truth, but justice doesn't expire. They laid out the story, methodically. Rachel Monroe, a young historian walking to her car in the snow. A man with access, proximity, and motive, a pattern of behavior corroborated by science. The DNA, the fiber, the surveillance footage, the hair clip, each detail built upon the last, painting a picture both tragic and undeniable. The defense countered by asserting that the DNA evidence could have been the result of accidental contact. Perhaps Rachel had handled a book or surface that Calloway had touched during his renovation work. They emphasized the absence of a direct witness and the decay of memory over time. "You're being asked," defense attorney Mark Dalton argued, "to build certainty on a foundation of dust." But the prosecution's response was unwavering. Forensic experts testified that the DNA was not just trace, but consistent with a direct recent transfer. Fiber analysts explained how particles on the glove and tarp could not have mingled without physical contact. The testimony of Calloway's former co-workers further weakened his credibility. One recalled how in early 2004, Calloway had arrived at work with a deep scratch on his neck, claiming he'd slipped on ice. Another described how he'd abruptly quit his job weeks later, claiming he needed to get out of Montana. The courtroom fell silent as Detective Kent took the stand. She spoke clearly, professionally, recounting how the investigation began with 3 forgotten fabric fragments and grew into a case built on persistence and technology. Sometimes, the smallest detail, she told the jury, is the loudest voice in a silent file. Her composure and precision resonated with the jurors. They could see the years of work distilled into this one moment. The files stacked neatly on the table, the cold patience of a detective who refused to let time bury the truth. The trial stretched over 2 weeks. Reporters described it as both scientific and deeply human, a clash between forensic certainty and the fragile memory of a town that had tried to move on. When closing arguments came, the prosecution did not appeal to outrage, but to logic. "This is not about what we wish happened," Daniel Holt told the jury. "It's about what did happen, and the evidence that tells us so." The defense tried one final strategy, claiming that without a recovered body, the case was incomplete. But forensic geologists had found sediment traces from the tarp, matching a secluded riverbank near Canyon Ferry Lake, about 20 miles east of Helena. Though extensive excavation found no remains, the environmental match further linked Calloway's property to the likely disposal site. When the jury retired for deliberation, the courtroom emptied into tense silence. The Monroe family sat together in the front row, hands clasped. Snow had begun falling again outside, soft, soundless, like the night it had all begun. After 12 hours, the jury returned. "On the charge of first-degree kidnapping," the 4-person read, "we find the defendant, Dennis Calloway, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty." The words rippled through the room like a release of breath. Rachel's parents clung to each other, tears mingling with relief. Detective Kent closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself the rare comfort of closure. Calloway sat motionless, his expression empty, his eyes fixed on the floor. Helena, once again blanketed in snow, held a quiet vigil that night. But this time, it wasn't for searching. It was for remembering. Candles glowed along the library steps, the same place where Rachel had last stood 18 years before. The community that had once mourned in confusion now gathered in resolution. The next morning, newspapers across the state carried the same headline in bold print: "Montana 2004 Cold Case Solved. Arrest Shocked Community." When the guilty verdict was read, Helena fell into a collective silence that no one present could forget. The snow outside the courthouse muffled the sound of traffic, as if the world itself had paused to listen. For 18 years, the Monroe family had waited for answers buried beneath layers of time and uncertainty. Now, as the courtroom emptied, they finally had them. Judge Evelyn Crawford thanked the jurors for their patience and diligence. The sentencing was scheduled for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and procedural motions. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, microphones glinting under the weak winter sun. Headlines went national within hours. "Montana 2004, Cold Case Solved, Arrest Shocked Community." For Detective Laura Kent, the verdict was both closure and continuation. She knew that solving a case didn't end a story. It only clarified its shape. There were still unanswered questions. What exactly had happened between 8:45 and 9:15 p.m. that night in 2004? How had Rachel Monroe's body disappeared so completely? And why had Calloway kept that newspaper clipping for so many years, tucked away like a trophy or a curse? In the weeks leading to sentencing, investigators revisited Calloway's property near Canyon Ferry Lake, focusing on the area where sediment samples had matched his tarp. The February thaw revealed patches of soil and debris previously hidden under snow. Searchers unearthed fragments of burned cloth, partially melted by old campfire remnants, and a rusted bracelet clasp. DNA analysis confirmed the fragments belonged to Rachel. That final discovery, though grim, gave her family what they had long been denied: a tangible sign that their daughter's story though stolen, had not vanished without trace. When shown the recovered bracelet, Linda Monroe whispered, "That was hers. She wore it every day." The sentencing hearing took place on March 3, 2022. The courtroom, once again filled to capacity, was steeped in an atmosphere of restrained grief. Calloway, wearing a plain gray suit, was escorted to the defendant's table by two officers. He looked older, more diminished than during the trial, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled his papers. Before the sentence was read, the Monroes were invited to speak. Thomas Monroe stood first. His voice, steady but hollowed by years of waiting, filled the silent room. "For almost 2 decades, my wife and I woke every morning wondering where our daughter was. We searched frozen rivers, fields, and our own hearts for answers. We lived with hope when there was none, and with fear when there shouldn't have been any. The people in this room, the detectives, the scientists, the jury, gave us something we thought we'd lost forever. The truth. And now we ask for justice." Then came Linda Monroe, smaller in stature but firm in resolve. She turned toward Calloway. "You took someone who only ever wanted to help others," she said softly. "You didn't just take her life. You took years of peace from everyone who loved her. But today we're not broken. You don't have that power anymore." The courtroom remained still as she returned to her seat, tears glistening in her eyes. Judge Crawford took a moment before speaking. "The passage of time does not lessen the gravity of crime," she began. "If anything, it deepens the wound, because it steals the years that truth might have offered comfort. Mr. Calloway, you showed no remorse, and lived freely, while a family grieved in uncertainty. For that, the law will now answer." She sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision was met with quiet sobs from the gallery, not of surprise but of finality. After the hearing, Detective Kent stood outside the courthouse steps as snow began to fall again. Reporters approached, but she declined interviews, saying only, "Rachel Monroe's story isn't about me. It's about persistence, hers and everyone who refused to let her be forgotten." For Helena, the case became more than a solved crime. It became a testament to endurance. In the months that followed, the town held a community memorial at Centennial Park. Hundreds gathered despite the cold. Candles lined the riverbank, their reflections shimmering in the icy current. The library where Rachel had worked dedicated a reading room in her memory, filled with the books she once cataloged. Above the entrance hung a simple bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Rachel Monroe, 1978-2004, her light endured the longest winter." Local schools began including her story in annual awareness programs about missing persons and forensic science. Teachers spoke of how technology, perseverance, and compassion could converge to uncover truth even after decades of silence. For younger generations, Rachel became more than a tragedy. She was a reminder that patience and faith in justice still mattered in an age of fading attention. Meanwhile, at the Montana Department of Justice, the success of the Monroe case led to an expansion of the cold case unit. Funding increased, and new teams were assigned to reevaluate older cases dating back to the 1980s. Dr. Aaron Lee, whose work on degraded DNA had been pivotal, launched a state initiative to reprocess biological samples from hundreds of archived investigations. Within 2 years, 3 additional cases saw breakthroughs, each tied to evidence once considered too damaged or incomplete. "The Monroe case changed how we see time," Dr. Lee said in a 2023 interview. "We used to think evidence expired. But evidence doesn't die, it just waits for the right eyes." As for Calloway, he was transferred to Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge. Prison records described him as uncooperative but subdued. He rarely spoke to other inmates, avoided the recreation yard, and spent most of his days in silence. Occasionally he received mail from journalists or documentary producers seeking interviews, but he never responded. A prison chaplain later revealed that during a counseling session, he said only, "You can bury things deep, but the snow always melts." For the Monroe family, life after the trial became quieter, though never entirely peaceful. They sold their home and moved to a small town near Flathead Lake, preferring anonymity over recognition. Every February they returned to Helena for the memorial at the library, laying a single white rose at the foot of the plaque. They never missed a year. In 2024, the 20th anniversary of Rachel's disappearance, a local filmmaker released a documentary titled The Silent Winter, The Rachel Monroe Story. It chronicled the investigation from 2004 to the trial's conclusion, blending interviews with detectives, forensic experts, and family members. One of the most powerful scenes featured Detective Kent standing in the empty parking lot of the Helena Public Library, the spot where Rachel's footprints had once ended in the snow. She didn't vanish, Kent said in the film, her breath visible in the cold air. She left clues, and we finally learned how to listen to them. The documentary won regional awards for investigative storytelling and brought renewed attention to cold case investigations across the American Northwest. Viewers from across the country were struck by the patience of the investigators and the haunting imagery of a town that refused to forget. In interviews following the release, Kent emphasized that the Monroe case was not an isolated success. For every solved file, there are 100 more still waiting, she said. It's not just about solving crimes. It's about giving names back to silence. The impact of Rachel's case reached beyond law enforcement. Montana lawmakers introduced a bill in 2023, establishing the Monroe Forensic Advancement Program, dedicated to funding rural DNA analysis and evidence preservation. Governor Elias Carpenter signed it into law, stating during the ceremony, "Rachel Monroe's legacy is one of knowledge. She taught us that truth is patient, but only if we are willing to pursue it." By 2025, the Cold Case Unit credited that program with helping identify suspects in multiple unresolved cases. Across Montana, investigators invoked Rachel's name as a symbol of persistence. The case that proved even the most fragile piece of evidence could carry a voice strong enough to echo across decades. In Helena, the library where it all began continued to serve as both a workplace and a memorial. Visitors often paused before the plaque, sometimes unaware of the story it represented, other times whispering softly, "She was found." Staff members kept a single framed photograph behind the front desk, Rachel smiling at her desk, surrounded by open books. Each February, as snow fell over the town, candles once again lined the library steps. Unlike the vigils of the past, these gatherings were no longer for searching or pleading. They were for remembering, not the night she disappeared, but the years of effort that brought her back into the light. Detective Kent attended most years, standing toward the back, her face partially hidden beneath her coat's hood. She never spoke during the ceremonies, never accepted public recognition. When asked once by a journalist why she still came, she replied, "Because closure isn't an ending, it's a promise kept. And in that promise, Helena found its peace." The Monroe case had begun as a mystery buried beneath snow and silence. It ended as a story of endurance, of parents who refused to stop hoping, of investigators who refused to stop searching, and of a town that refused to forget one of its own. Years later, people in Helena still spoke of that winter, of the girl who vanished and the detective who refused to let her remain lost. They spoke of the snow, the silence, and the science that broke through both. And they spoke always of the truth that came too late but came nonetheless. In the words of Rachel's father, engraved beneath her memorial plaque, "Justice may take its time, but truth never loses its way home." 500 words.